September 6, 1976, 1:47 p.m. local time. A Soviet MiG-25 Foxbat, the most feared interceptor in the world, screamed across the Sea of Japan at nearly 500 miles per hour, flying dangerously low just 200 feet above the waves. In the cockpit sat Lieutenant Viktor Ivanovich Belenko, 29 years old, a decorated Soviet Air Force pilot. His hands gripped the control stick with white-knuckled intensity. His fuel gauge blinked red. Less than 2 minutes of flight time remained. Behind him, the entire Soviet air defense network had erupted into chaos. Radar stations tracked his rogue aircraft. Fighter jets scrambled from multiple bases. Ground control screamed into radio frequencies he had switched off minutes earlier. Soviet military commanders knew exactly what was happening. One of their elite pilots was defecting with the crown jewel of Soviet aviation technology. What those commanders didn't know, what they couldn't have imagined, was that Viktor Belenko's defection wasn't motivated by money, blackmail, or Western recruitment. It was motivated by something far more devastating to Soviet power: disbelief. Belenko no longer believed anything his government told him. And that loss of faith began not with grand ideology or political awakening, but with a simple photograph of an American supermarket that he was certain must be propaganda. The story of how a Soviet fighter pilot came to risk everything, his life, his family, his entire identity, to discover whether American grocery stores were real is the story of how the Soviet Union lost the Cold War without firing a shot. This is the story of Viktor Belenko. Viktor Ivanovich Belenko was born on February 15, 1947, in Nalchik, a city in the North Caucasus region of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic. His father worked as a tractor driver on a collective farm. His mother worked in a textile factory. They were ordinary Soviet citizens, exactly the kind of working-class family the Communist Revolution claimed to serve and uplift. Belenko's childhood was defined by the standard deprivations of Soviet life in the 1950s. His family lived in a small apartment shared with another family. One bathroom for both families. No hot water except when the temperamental central system functioned. Electricity that worked inconsistently. Food was perpetually scarce. Meat appeared in state stores perhaps once a week, and when it did, lines formed immediately. Fresh fruits were available only in late summer. Butter, sugar, and coffee required both ration cards and connections to obtain. But young Victor had no basis for comparison. Everyone he knew lived similarly. The propaganda that surrounded him from birth taught a clear narrative. Soviet workers, despite temporary hardships from rebuilding after the Great Patriotic War, lived with dignity and security. Meanwhile, in capitalist countries like America, workers faced brutal exploitation, grinding poverty, and desperate unemployment. The few rich Americans lived in luxury while the masses suffered. This narrative was reinforced everywhere in schools and newspapers, on radio broadcasts and mandatory political education sessions. The West was failing. The Soviet Union was ascending. History itself was on the side of socialism. Victor showed aptitude for mathematics and engineering. His teachers recognized his abilities and recommended him for advanced education. In 1965, at age 18, Belenko was accepted into the Armavir Higher Military Aviation School, one of the Soviet Union's premier pilot training institutions. This was an extraordinary opportunity, a path to becoming a Soviet Air Force pilot, joining the elite defenders of the Motherland, flying the most advanced aircraft in the world. The Armavir School provided Belenko's first glimpse of relative privilege within the Soviet system. Military cadets received better food than ordinary civilians, though it remained sparse by any objective standard. They had access to military stores with slightly better supplies than public shops. They wore uniforms and boots that, while often poorly made, were provided by the state. They were told repeatedly that they were being trained to fly aircraft superior to anything NATO possessed, to defend Soviet airspace against American aggression. But the training also exposed uncomfortable realities. The aircraft they trained on were poorly maintained. Parts were chronically unavailable. Maintenance crews improvised repairs using whatever materials they could scavenge. Equipment malfunctioned with troubling regularity. In 1968, during Belenko's training, a fellow cadet experienced a critical malfunction during flight. His ejection seat, manufactured in Soviet factories that proclaimed their technological superiority, failed to function properly. The parachute deployed incorrectly. The young pilot, whose name was recorded in official records as dying from pilot error, was killed on impact. The other cadets knew the truth. The equipment had failed, but questioning equipment quality was questioning the system itself, and such questions were dangerous. They flew aircraft that leaked hydraulic fluid. They wore flight suits that tore easily. They ate in cafeterias where meat was rare. Yet they were told constantly that they were the privileged elite of Soviet society, that ordinary citizens had even less, and that Soviet technology led the world. If this was elite privilege, young Belenko began to wonder, what did ordinary Soviet citizens endure? And if Soviet technology was truly superior, why did their equipment fail so often? In 1971, Lieutenant Viktor Belenko received his assignment to the 513th Fighter Regiment, 11th Air Army Soviet Air Defense Forces, stationed at Chuguyevka Air Base near Vladivostok. His aircraft assignment was the MiG-25 Foxbat. This was the absolute pinnacle of Soviet military aviation. Western intelligence feared the MiG-25 more than any other Soviet aircraft. NATO strategists believed it could fly at Mach 3.2, could reach altitudes above 80,000 feet, and could intercept any American bomber or reconnaissance aircraft with virtual impunity. The reality Belenko discovered was more complex and far more troubling. The MiG-25 was indeed extraordinarily fast, capable of speeds exceeding Mach 2.8. It could reach extreme altitudes, but it achieved these capabilities through brute force rather than sophisticated engineering. The airframe was constructed primarily from nickel steel, not titanium or advanced alloys, making the aircraft extremely heavy, over 64,000 pounds fully loaded. The engines were massive turbojets, essentially giant tubes that consumed fuel at catastrophic rates. At maximum speed, a MiG-25 would burn through its fuel supply in approximately 20 minutes. Most revealing was the avionics. When Belenko first examined the MiG-25's electronic systems during technical training, he was stunned to discover they were based on vacuum tube technology. Vacuum tubes, the same technology American radios had used in the 1940s, technology the West had abandoned for transistors and integrated circuits more than a decade earlier. Soviet engineers hadn't chosen vacuum tubes because they were superior. They used them because Soviet semiconductor manufacturing was so primitive that reliable solid-state electronics couldn't be produced in the quantities and quality required for military aviation. The Soviet Union, which claimed technological leadership, was using electronics technology from the 1940s in its most advanced fighter aircraft of the 1970s. The maintenance situation was even more damaging to Belenko's faith in Soviet superiority. The 513th Fighter Regiment nominally operated 40 MiG-25 aircraft. On any given day, perhaps 25 were actually flyable. Parts were unavailable for months. Engines that should have been replaced continued operation because replacements weren't in supply. Maintenance crews improvised repairs using whatever materials they could obtain, sometimes cannibalizing non-essential components from one aircraft to keep another operational. This was an elite fighter regiment flying the Soviet Union's most advanced interceptor, and it operated at barely 60% effectiveness due to chronic supply problems and equipment failures. Belenko learned to read between the lines of official briefings. When Soviet intelligence officers said American pilots were reckless and poorly disciplined, he understood this actually meant American pilots were aggressive and confident. When they said American aircraft were fragile and unreliable, he knew this likely meant NATO aircraft were actually more sophisticated than Soviet equivalents. The Soviet system, he was beginning to understand, consistently inverted truth in its official communications. In 1973, Captain Viktor Belenko married Lyudmila Nikolaevna, a schoolteacher at the local military school near Chuguyevka. Marriage brought official benefits. As a married Soviet Air Force officer, Belenko received improved housing allocation. One room in a building shared with 4 other military families. They shared one bathroom among all families. Hot water was available only when the central heating system was operational, which was perhaps 60% of the time. Heat during the brutal Siberian winters functioned when the central system worked, which wasn't always. This was considered good housing for a Soviet officer. Ludmila earned 120 rubles per month as a teacher. Viktor earned 240 rubles as a fighter pilot. Their combined income of 360 rubles monthly placed them well above the average Soviet salary of approximately 150 rubles. They were, by Soviet standards, relatively privileged and comfortable. Yet their daily life was a constant struggle against scarcity. The state stores might have meat once or twice weekly, and when it appeared, lines formed immediately, sometimes hundreds of people waiting for hours. Fresh vegetables outside of late summer harvest were virtually unknown. Coffee was rare and expensive. Sugar required ration coupons. When chocolate appeared in stores, usually around major holidays, people waited in lines for hours to purchase small quantities, perhaps 100 grams per person if supplies lasted. They owned no automobile. The waiting list for a Lada, the standard Soviet car, was 10 to 12 years, and even then, approval required demonstrating proper party connections and political reliability. A Lada cost approximately 8,000 rubles, more than 3 years' combined salary for Viktor and Ludmila. Even bicycles required waiting lists and bureaucratic approvals. To travel beyond the local region, they needed internal passports and official permissions. International travel, even to other communist countries, was restricted to those with special authorization and demonstrated loyalty. Viktor and Ludmila's possessions consisted of one Soviet-made radio that worked intermittently, receiving only official state broadcasts, one small black and white television, receiving 2 channels of state programming, basic furniture provided with their housing allocation, minimal clothing, much of it worn and repeatedly repaired, kitchen implements adequate for basic cooking, a hot plate for food preparation. No appliances beyond these basics. This was the life of privileged Soviet military elite. A fighter pilot defending the motherland and his wife lived in one room, shared a bathroom with 4 other families, owned virtually nothing, and struggled constantly to obtain basic necessities. And they were told, every single day through every form of media and official communication, that they lived better than people in the West, that American workers faced exploitation and desperate poverty, that capitalism was failing while socialism was building a glorious future. The incident that would shatter Viktor Belenko's remaining faith in Soviet propaganda occurred in June 1975 during what should have been a routine political education session. These sessions were mandatory for all Soviet military personnel, typically conducted weekly by KGB political officers attached to military units. Their purpose was to reinforce communist ideology, celebrate Soviet achievements, and warn against Western propaganda and influences. On this particular June afternoon, a KGB captain named Makarov delivered a standard presentation on the deteriorating conditions in capitalist countries, particularly the United States. He showed photographs meant to illustrate American social decay, urban poverty, and worker exploitation. Images of homeless people, unemployment lines, decaying neighborhoods, protests, and social problems. This was standard Soviet propaganda technique. Every society has problems. Soviet propagandists simply selected images of Western problems while never showing Soviet difficulties, creating an impression that capitalism was failing comprehensively. Captain Makarov displayed a photograph described as showing a typical American slum neighborhood in Philadelphia, meant to demonstrate capitalist failure and the desperate conditions of American workers. The KGB officer pointed out the rundown appearance of some buildings, litter on one corner, general urban decay. This, he explained, was the reality of American capitalism, workers living in poverty while the wealthy elite exploited their labor. But Viktor Belenko was looking at something else in that photograph. Something Captain Makarov apparently didn't notice, or hoped no one would mention. In the background of this supposed poverty photograph, clearly visible through a store window, were shelves. Shelves stocked with products in varieties and quantities Belenko had never seen in any Soviet store, including the restricted shops available only to military officers and party members. He could make out cans and boxes and packages in multiple colors and brands, stacked in seemingly casual abundance. Even more striking, parked along this supposedly impoverished American street were 8 private automobiles. 8 cars visible in a single photograph of a slum neighborhood. Belenko did quick mental calculations. In the entire city of Chuguyevka, with a population of over 40,000 people, there were perhaps 30 or 40 private automobiles, owned exclusively by high-ranking party officials and military commanders. In Soviet cities, seeing 2 or 3 cars on a street was notable. This American slum photograph showed 8 cars in a single frame. The contradiction was jarring. If these Americans were living in desperate poverty, as Captain Makarov claimed, why did they have so many private automobiles? Why did the store in the background appear so well stocked? Belenko raised his hand. The room fell silent. Other pilots shifted uncomfortably. Asking questions during political education sessions was unusual and potentially dangerous. These sessions were not discussions. They were indoctrination. You listened, you agreed, you demonstrated proper socialist consciousness. Comrade Captain, Belenko said carefully, if these Americans are living in poverty, why do they have so many private automobiles? Captain Makarov's expression hardened. His eyes narrowed. For a moment he said nothing, apparently deciding how to respond to this unexpected challenge. These are not their automobiles, Captain Belenko, Makarov said coldly. These cars belong to factory owners, landlords, and criminals who exploit these neighborhoods. The poor workers you see live in terrible conditions, while the rich drive these cars through their communities to mock their poverty. This is the nature of capitalist exploitation. The explanation was technically possible, but something about it didn't align with the visual evidence. If the cars belonged to wealthy people coming to exploit poor neighborhoods, why were they parked casually on the street rather than in secured areas? Why were they standard sedans rather than luxury vehicles? Why did the photograph show such abundance in the background store if this was genuinely a poverty-stricken area? After the briefing ended, Belenko's squadron mate, Captain Volkov, pulled him aside in the hallway. Victor, you ask dangerous questions, Volkov said quietly, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. I understand curiosity, but such questions get noted in your file. The KGB reports everything. Be more careful. Then Volkov added something in a voice barely above a whisper, leaning close. My uncle worked at the Soviet embassy in Paris for 2 years in the 1960s. When he returned to Moscow, he was different. Quiet, withdrawn. One night after drinking, he told my father that embassy staff shopped in French stores using diplomatic privileges. He said what he saw in those ordinary French supermarkets made him question everything he'd been taught about Soviet superiority. He said this once, quietly, and never spoke of it again. Some truths are too dangerous to acknowledge. That night, Viktor Belenko lay awake in the single room he shared with his wife, unable to sleep. He kept seeing that photograph, those automobiles, those store shelves. He began to notice other inconsistencies and contradictions in Soviet propaganda about the West. Soviet news reports about America never showed ordinary life. No footage of normal neighborhoods, typical families, everyday activities. They showed only carefully selected images of problems, protests, poverty, crime, social conflict. Why? If American life was genuinely as terrible as propaganda claimed, why not show more of it? Soviet citizens who had any contact with foreigners faced immediate and extensive KGB investigation. Even casual conversations with foreign tourists or business visitors required detailed debriefing. Owning Western manufactured goods, even simple items like pens or clothing, attracted official suspicion and questions about how such items were obtained. Most tellingly, the penalties for attempting to leave the Soviet Union were severe. The borders were heavily fortified with guard towers, minefields, barbed wire, and armed patrols, not to keep enemies out, but to keep Soviet citizens in. If a life in the West was truly as terrible as propaganda claimed, if capitalism really was failing and socialism was superior, why did the state invest such enormous resources preventing people from seeing Western countries for themselves? The logic didn't work. If Western poverty and exploitation were real, the Soviet government should encourage citizens to visit the West and see its failures firsthand. Instead, international travel was restricted to the most politically reliable citizens, who were monitored constantly and debriefed extensively upon return. An additional incident in June 1975 would further damage Belenko's faith in official narratives. A transport aircraft carrying supplies from Vladivostok to Chuguyevka crashed approximately 30 miles from base due to engine failure. Belenko was assigned to the recovery and security team sent to secure the crash site and salvage any sensitive materials. Among the scattered cargo were supplies destined for the officer's store at Chuguyevka, the restricted shop where military officers could purchase goods unavailable to ordinary Soviet citizens. The crash had scattered these packages across a field, revealing contents that were supposed to remain hidden from ordinary soldiers and civilians. Cases of imported coffee from Vietnam, chocolate from East Germany, canned meat from Bulgaria, condensed milk from Poland, tobacco from Cuba. Even some consumer items from Finland that had somehow entered Soviet distribution chains through complex trade arrangements. These were luxuries that ordinary Soviet citizens saw rarely, if ever. Yet they were routine supplies for military officers, evidence of a two-tier system where the elite enjoyed privileges while ordinary citizens struggled with constant shortages. But one container had broken open completely, spilling its contents across the mud. Western magazines' English and German language publications with their covers torn off. These were clearly intelligence materials or items confiscated from foreigners at borders and checkpoints, being transported to military intelligence for analysis. Several pages had fallen out and scattered. Belenko quickly gathered a few before they could be secured by the KGB political officer supervising the recovery. He glanced at them rapidly, knowing he had only seconds. What he saw shook his understanding of reality. The pages included advertisements from American and West German magazines, commercial advertisements for consumer products, automobiles, household appliances, food items, electronics, clothing. One advertisement showed an American kitchen in what appeared to be an ordinary suburban home. The refrigerator visible in the photograph was enormous, larger than the small refrigerators that only Soviet elite could obtain after years on waiting lists. The countertops displayed more food than Viktor and Ludmila would see in a month. Multiple appliances, devices for cooking, for mixing, for food preparation, represented technology Belenko didn't even know existed for home use. Another page showed an automobile advertisement. The car, described in the text as affordable family transportation, was photographed in a suburban driveway. In the background, two other cars were visible. 3 cars for one family, treated as normal in an advertisement targeting ordinary consumers. The KGB political officer, Senior Lieutenant Volkov, noticed Belenko examining the magazine pages. He walked over quickly and took them from Belenko's hands with a sharp motion. "Propaganda, Captain," Volkov said coldly. "The Americans produce these materials to make their failing system appear successful. It's all fabrication. Lies designed to make capitalism look viable when in reality American workers live in desperate conditions." Don't be deceived by capitalist advertising techniques. This is exactly the kind of psychological warfare we warn you about. But Belenko had noticed something the political officer perhaps missed or chose to ignore. These weren't propaganda materials in the traditional sense. They weren't government publications designed to impress foreigners with American achievements. They were commercial advertisements created by private companies designed to sell products to American consumers. Why would American companies spend money creating elaborate false advertisements showing abundance that didn't exist? The economic logic didn't work. Advertisements only made sense if they depicted products that actually existed and could actually be purchased. Creating fake advertisements for non-existent products would be pointless. It wouldn't generate sales, and it would damage the company's reputation when consumers discovered the deception. These advertisements made economic sense only if the products were real, the abundance was real, and American consumers genuinely had money to purchase these items. The alternative, that American companies created massive fraudulent advertising campaigns for products that didn't exist, made no sense whatsoever. That evening, sitting in his single room while Ludmila prepared their modest dinner on the hot plate, Viktor Belenko thought through the implications of what he'd observed. The Soviet government had told him his entire life that capitalism was failing, that American workers lived in poverty, that Soviet socialism represented humanity's future while capitalism was dying. Yet every piece of evidence that slipped through the propaganda barrier contradicted these claims. Photographs meant to show American poverty showed casual car ownership. Magazine advertisements confiscated as propaganda showed abundance beyond Soviet imagination. Soviet pilots and the best equipment available couldn't catch American reconnaissance aircraft that were over a decade old. Soviet factories couldn't produce the consumer goods that appeared routinely in Western advertisements. A terrible possibility began forming in Belenko's mind. What if everything he'd been told was not just exaggerated but systematically inverted? What if the Soviet Union wasn't leading the world but falling catastrophically behind? What if the hardships Soviet citizens endured weren't necessary sacrifices for a glorious future, but symptoms of a fundamentally failing system? These questions, once formed, couldn't be unasked. And in the Soviet Union, they were dangerous beyond measure. Citizens who persistently questioned official truth weren't treated as political dissidents. They were diagnosed with sluggish schizophrenia, a Soviet psychiatric invention, and sent to mental hospitals where they were forcibly medicated until they either accepted official reality or became genuinely mentally ill from the treatment. Belenko said nothing to his wife. He said nothing to his fellow officers. He said nothing to anyone, but he began paying closer attention to contradictions and inconsistencies. He began keeping a mental catalog of things that didn't align with official narratives. And he began thinking about the unthinkable: defection. Planning a defection would take more than a year. Defection by Soviet military pilots was rare and extraordinarily difficult. The KGB maintained extensive surveillance on all military personnel, especially pilots, who possessed both the means and potential motivation to flee. Pilots were never allowed to fly solo near borders without extensive security protocols. Flight routes were monitored constantly. Any deviation from assigned paths triggered immediate alerts and responses. Moreover, the consequences for failure were absolute. If Belenko were caught attempting to defect, he would be executed after extensive interrogation. His wife Ludmila would be arrested, interrogated, and sent to a psychiatric hospital or labor camp. His mother would lose her housing and pension. His siblings would lose their jobs and social positions. The Soviet state enacted comprehensive vengeance on defectors' families as both punishment and deterrent. Could Belenko condemn Ludmila to such a fate? His mother? Could he destroy everyone he loved for the sake of discovering whether American supermarkets were real? These moral questions haunted him throughout 1975 and into 1976. He gradually became emotionally distant from his wife, not because he loved her less, but because he was preparing himself psychologically for what he might do. He studied maps of Japan, memorizing the location of Hakodate Airport on Hokkaido Island. He calculated fuel requirements and maximum range for the MiG-25 at various altitudes and speeds. He watched weather patterns over the Sea of Japan, noting when cloud cover would provide concealment from visual detection. Most difficult was the moral dimension. He wasn't fleeing persecution, he wasn't under investigation, wasn't facing arrest, hadn't committed any crime. He was a privileged Soviet officer with an excellent career, living comfortably by Soviet standards. Defection would make him a traitor in Soviet eyes, a criminal who stole military property and betrayed his oath to defend the motherland. But Belenko had reached a conclusion that made other considerations secondary. His government had lied to him systematically, comprehensively, about everything his entire life. The system he was defending was built on lies so pervasive that questioning them was treated as mental illness. He needed to know the truth, even if the price was everything and everyone he had known. By late August 1976, Belenko had made his final decision. He would defect at the first opportunity. He would fly his MiG-25 to Japan, surrender to authorities there, request political asylum through the United States, and discover for himself whether the abundance he'd glimpsed in that magazine advertisement was real or propaganda. September the 6th, 1976, conditions aligned perfectly. Weather forecasts showed scattered clouds over the Sea of Japan, ideal for concealment during the initial escape. Belenko's squadron was scheduled for routine patrol exercises along the Soviet coast, flights that would take them within 200 miles of Japanese airspace. The mission profile included standard tactical maneuvers where aircraft temporarily separated from formation during turns and altitude changes. At 11:30 a.m. local time, 4 MiG-25 interceptors from the 513th Fighter Regiment took off from Chuguievka Air Base. The formation commander was Major Kuznetsov, an experienced pilot whom Belenko respected. Belenko flew as number 3 aircraft in the formation. The mission plan called for a standard coastal patrol, then return to base. Total planned flight time approximately 90 minutes. The formation flew north along the Soviet coast at 38,000 feet, maintaining standard patrol pattern. Belenko performed all required radio checks, responded to all communications, flew perfect formation. Everything appeared routine and normal. Ground control had no reason for suspicion. At 12:47 p.m., approximately 77 minutes into the flight, the formation entered a cloud bank while executing a planned turn. This was the moment Belenko had been waiting for. He broke formation abruptly, pushing his throttles to maximum military power, and dove toward the sea in a steep descent. Within seconds, he had descended to less than 200 feet above the water, below the effective coverage of Soviet coastal radar systems, and turned sharply southeast toward Japan. The Soviet response was immediate and massive. Within 3 minutes, ground control was calling his aircraft frantically on all frequencies. The squadron commander was ordering him to respond and return to formation. Within 5 minutes, the Soviet air defense network had categorized the situation as a probable defection. Fighter aircraft began scrambling from multiple bases. Surface-to-air missile batteries along the coast were placed on alert. Navy vessels in the area received urgent communications. But Belenko had a critical advantage: surprise and the MiG-25's extraordinary speed. By the time Soviet interceptors could reach his last known position, he would be in Japanese airspace. The MiG-25, for all its technical flaws, remained the fastest operational fighter aircraft in the world. At maximum speed and low altitude, he was nearly impossible to intercept. The fuel situation, however, was critical and growing desperate. The MiG-25's massive engines consumed fuel at catastrophic rates, especially at low altitude and maximum power settings where air resistance was higher. Belenko calculated he had perhaps 20 to 25 minutes of fuel remaining. The distance to Hakodate was approximately 280 miles. He would arrive with virtually empty tanks, if he arrived at all. The Sea of Japan passed below in a gray-green blur. His altitude warning system screamed continuously, protesting flight so dangerously close to the waves. The control stick shook with turbulence from the low-altitude air. Every second brought him closer to either freedom or a water landing that would certainly be fatal. The MiG-25 was not designed for ditching, and ejecting at such low altitude would likely kill him. At 1:09 p.m., the Japanese coast appeared ahead through scattered clouds. Belenko pulled up to 5,000 feet and visually searched for Hakodate Airport. His fuel gauge showed less than 5 minutes of flying time remaining. The engines were consuming the last reserves. Warning lights illuminated across his instrument panel. There, the airport, a civilian facility with a single main runway, appeared to the south of his position. Belenko turned toward it, simultaneously trying to recall the English phrases he had practiced. His English was minimal, barely functional, learned from forbidden language books he had studied secretly during his preparation. He lowered his landing gear, a decision that increased drag dramatically and further accelerated fuel consumption. But landing without gear would destroy the aircraft and possibly kill him. The MiG-25's approach speed was far too high for safe landing on a civilian runway designed for commercial aircraft. He deployed speed brakes and began a steep descent, shedding altitude and speed as rapidly as possible. The airport tower was certainly tracking him now, certainly confused or alarmed by the sight of an unidentified military aircraft approaching at high speed without communication or clearance. Ground personnel and passengers at the terminal had stopped to watch this unexpected arrival. At 1:16 p.m. local time, Senior Lieutenant Viktor Ivanovich Belenko landed his MiG-25 Foxbat on runway 30 at Hakodate Airport. The landing was rough, fast, and dangerous. His approach speed was approximately 50 miles per hour, faster than safe landing speed. He braked hard, tires smoking and squealing, engines dying, as the absolute last fuel was consumed. The aircraft rolled approximately 4,000 feet before stopping, nearly reaching the end of the runway. Belenko shut down all systems, unstrapped himself from the ejection seat, and opened the canopy. His legs shook from adrenaline and physical stress. Japanese airport vehicles were approaching rapidly, sirens wailing. Ground personnel stood frozen, uncertain what was happening. A few passengers and airport workers watched from the terminal, equally confused. Belenko climbed down from the cockpit carefully. He had practiced his English phrase hundreds of times in his mind during the long flight. As Japanese airport security vehicles surrounded him, he raised both hands to show he was unarmed and spoke in heavily accented English. "I am Soviet pilot. I request political asylum. I want American embassy. I not return Soviet Union. Please, I want American embassy." The Japanese security personnel looked at each other with obvious uncertainty, clearly unsure how to proceed with this unprecedented situation. One guard who spoke some English repeated Belenko's request into a radio. Within minutes, Japanese police arrived. Within hours, American intelligence officers were being notified across multiple agencies. Within 2 days, what would become one of the most significant Soviet military defections of the entire Cold War would begin to unfold. The initial hours were confusing and chaotic for everyone involved. Japanese authorities had no established protocol for handling Soviet fighter pilots who requested asylum by landing military aircraft at civilian airports. The diplomatic implications were enormous and potentially dangerous. The Soviet Union was demanding immediate return of both pilot and aircraft, making vague threats about consequences if Japan didn't comply. Japan's relationship with the USSR was already tense. American intelligence desperately wanted access to both the pilot and the MiG-25, which represented intelligence value worth potentially billions of dollars. Belenko was taken to a secure room at Hakodate Airport while Japanese officials contacted Tokyo and began frantic diplomatic consultations among various government ministries. He was not arrested in any formal sense, but he also was definitely not free. Japanese police provided security while government officials at the highest levels decided what to do with this unexpected diplomatic crisis. Then something simple and human happened. A Japanese police officer acting on basic human compassion rather than any protocol noticed that Belenko looked exhausted and asked through a translator if he was hungry. He hadn't eaten since breakfast at Chuguyevka Air Base that morning, and the intense stress of defection had left him physically and emotionally drained. The police officer ordered food from a local restaurant near the airport. What arrived was a standard Japanese bento box, an ordinary lunch by Japanese standards, the kind of meal office workers ate every day, nothing special or unusual. To Viktor Belenko, it represented his first introduction to an abundance he had never imagined possible. The bento box contained white rice, pure and clean, not the mixture of grains, fillers, and occasional impurities common in Soviet cafeterias. Grilled fish, fresh and skillfully prepared. Multiple types of pickled vegetables in varieties he couldn't identify. A small piece of tamagoyaki, a sweet Japanese egg omelet. Fresh fruit including an orange slice miso soup, hot and flavorful green tea. The portion size exceeded what Belenko typically consumed for dinner in the Soviet Union. The quality of every ingredient was superior to anything available in regular Soviet stores. The presentation showed care and attention that Soviet institutional food never possessed. Later, Belenko would testify that he sat staring at this lunch for several minutes before eating, unable to immediately process what it meant. This was Japan, which Soviet propaganda described as a capitalist country where workers faced exploitation and most people lived in difficult conditions under American occupation influence. Yet apparently, even a police station in a small city could casually order such food from a local restaurant for an unexpected prisoner, and it was considered normal, ordinary, nothing remotely special. The police officer, noticing Belenko's hesitation through the language barrier, asked through the translator if the food was acceptable. Would he prefer something else? Tea? Coffee? Something different? Belenko ate slowly, deliberately, trying to make the meal last, savoring every bite. When he finished, he asked the translator to convey his deep thanks to the officer for the meal. Then he asked a question that the translator found odd. How much would such a meal cost if purchased at a restaurant? The translator consulted with the police officer, then answered, he says perhaps 500 to 600 yen, maybe equivalent to what an ordinary Japanese worker earns in approximately 1 hour of work. Belenko did rapid mental calculations, trying to convert to rubles through various exchange rate formulas. In Soviet terms, however, this meal represented food quality and quantity that would cost perhaps 8 to 10 rubles if somehow all components were available simultaneously, which they never were. That was nearly half a day's wages for an average Soviet worker, for a single ordinary lunch that a Japanese worker could purchase with 1 hour's earnings. Over the next 3 days, while Japanese and American diplomats negotiated Belenko's status and Soviet officials demanded his forcible return, he was housed in a hotel room in Hakodate under constant security guard. The hotel, by Japanese standards of that era, was middle-range and unremarkable, decent but nothing luxurious, the sort of place business travelers might stay for 1 or 2 nights. To Viktor Belenko, this ordinary Japanese business hotel represented wealth beyond his previous comprehension or imagination. The room featured electricity that never failed, available 24 hours daily with no interruptions, hot and cold running water at all times, instantly available at any hour, a private bathroom with flush toilet, sink, and shower producing unlimited hot water, a color television with multiple channels, broadcasting various programs, a telephone that could make calls freely, heating and air conditioning that worked consistently and could be adjusted to personal preference furniture that was solid, clean, well-made, and comfortable clean linens that were changed daily by hotel staff. The CIA officers who began arriving to negotiate Belenko's defection and eventual transfer to American custody noted in their detailed reports that he spent considerable time, more than an hour on the first evening, simply turning the hot water faucet in the bathroom sink on and off repeatedly, apparently fascinated and almost disbelieving that unlimited hot water was available instantly at any hour of day or night. In the Soviet Union, hot water was available perhaps 2 to 4 hours daily in buildings equipped with central heating systems, and many buildings, including most outside major cities, had no hot water at all. The television mesmerized him. Japanese television in 1976 broadcast in full color, a technology Soviet television was only beginning to implement in limited areas of Moscow and a few other major cities. Most Soviet citizens had never seen color television, but more shocking to Belenko than the color technology was the content. Commercial advertisements, dozens of them per hour, hundreds during a single evening of viewing. Advertisements showing products available for purchase: automobiles, consumer electronics, food items, clothing, household goods, appliances, entertainment, services. Advertisement after advertisement after advertisement, all showcasing variety and abundance, all assuming viewers had money and ability to purchase these items. Belenko understood intellectually that advertisements exaggerate and present products in their most favorable light. This was a universal marketing technique. But the sheer variety, the overwhelming quantity, the casual assumption that ordinary Japanese people could and would purchase these items contradicted everything he had been taught about capitalist countries and worker exploitation. If these were all lies and propaganda, why would Japanese companies spend enormous sums of money on such elaborate and expensive falsehoods? Television advertising was expensive. Creating these commercials cost money. Broadcasting them cost money. The only way this made economic sense was if the products were real, were actually available for purchase, and enough consumers had sufficient money to buy them that advertising created profitable returns. The advertisements weren't trying to convince him that capitalism was superior. They weren't even aware of his existence. They were simply trying to sell products to Japanese consumers. Their very existence proved a level of consumer abundance that shouldn't exist in a capitalist country according to everything Soviet propaganda had taught him. On September 9th, after intense diplomatic negotiations, Japanese authorities agreed to transfer Belenko to American custody. The diplomatic solution was elegant and preserved Japan's relationship with both superpowers. Japan would return the MiG-25 aircraft to the Soviet Union in accordance with international law, but only after American intelligence had thoroughly examined it. Meanwhile, Japan would honor Belenko's individual asylum request by transferring him to United States custody. The Soviet government protested vigorously through multiple diplomatic channels, but had little practical recourse beyond formal complaints. A U.S. Air Force C-141 Starlifter transport aircraft flew Belenko from Japan to a military base in Alaska, then onward to Andrews Air Force Base in Maryland. These flights, absolutely routine military transport operations by American standards, provided Belenko with further education in the vast gap between Soviet propaganda and Western reality. The C-141 crew treated him with courtesy and even kindness, despite knowing he had stolen a Soviet military aircraft. They offered him food, not special meals prepared for an important defector, simply the standard in-flight rations that regular U.S. Air Force personnel received during transport flights. Sandwiches with actual meat, multiple beverage options including soda and juice, fruit, cookies, coffee prepared from real coffee beans rather than the ersatz substitute common in the Soviet Union. The quantity and quality exceeded what Soviet Air Force officers received as supposedly privileged rations. When Belenko expressed surprise at the quality of the food through the interpreter traveling with him, one crew member, a technical sergeant, actually tried to apologize. "Sorry, the food's not better, sir," the sergeant said. "Just standard Air Force transport rations, nothing special. When we get you to Andrews, the officers there will make sure you get a proper meal." Belenko tried to explain through the translator that this food was better than what Soviet fighter pilots received as elite military rations. The sergeant seemed genuinely confused, unable to comprehend how what Americans considered standard or even substandard institutional food could be considered excellent by Soviet military standards. The C-141's interior represented another revelation. The cargo aircraft was well-maintained, clean, functional. Every system worked reliably. The crew was professional but relaxed, exhibiting none of the rigid, paranoid formality that characterized Soviet military culture. The equipment functioned without the constant improvisations and breakdowns that plagued Soviet aviation. Everything suggested an organization with adequate resources, proper maintenance, and systematic training. When the transport landed at Andrews Air Force Base outside Washington, D.C., Belenko's formal CIA debriefing process began in earnest. The Central Intelligence Agency had been preparing for this opportunity, recognizing that Belenko represented extraordinary intelligence value from multiple perspectives. His technical knowledge of the MiG-25 and Soviet air defense systems, his insights into Soviet military training and culture, and his potential observations about Soviet society and the effectiveness of communist propaganda. The CIA established a safe house for Belenko in a Washington suburb, a standard middle-class American home that had been quietly requisitioned for intelligence purposes. To Belenko, walking into this house for the first time, it represented luxury and space beyond comprehension. The house had 3 bedrooms for what would be a single occupant, 2 full bathrooms, each with hot and cold running water, toilets, sinks, and showers, a complete kitchen with full-size refrigerator freezer, electric stove with oven, dishwasher, and multiple small appliances, central heating and air conditioning controlled by a thermostat. Hot water available unlimited at all times. A living room with color television receiving multiple channels. A separate dining room. A basement for storage. A garage for automobile parking. A yard with grass and trees. This was, the CIA officers explained to Belenko through interpreters, a typical middle-class American home, nothing special or unusual, simply average housing for an ordinary American professional family, perhaps a teacher, an engineer, a middle manager, or a skilled tradesperson. Belenko walked through the room slowly, opening closets, examining fixtures, trying to process what he was seeing. In the Soviet Union, His single-room apartment shared with four other families in a building with one bathroom and inconsistent utilities had been considered good housing for a military officer. This American middle-class house, designated as unremarkable and typical, had more space, more amenities, more comfort, and more technology than housing available to all but the highest-ranking Soviet officials, members of the Politburo, military generals, KGB leadership. The kitchen particularly stunned him. The refrigerator was larger than refrigerators available only to Soviet elite after years on waiting lists. It had a separate freezer compartment capable of storing food for weeks. The stove had 4 burners and a full oven. There were multiple cabinets providing extensive storage. The counter space exceeded what even privileged Soviet housing provided. There was a dishwasher, a machine that automatically washed dishes, a technology Belenko hadn't known existed for residential use. The CIA officers showed Belenko how various appliances worked. The garbage disposal, a device mounted under the sink that ground up food waste, the coffee maker that automatically brewed coffee on a timer, the toaster, the electric can opener. Each appliance represented consumer technology that simply didn't exist in Soviet homes, not because Soviet engineering couldn't theoretically produce such devices, but because Soviet industrial capacity was so completely consumed by military production that it couldn't manufacture consumer goods in quantity or quality. But the CIA had planned something more significant for Belenko's education in American reality. They understood from previous defector experiences that Soviet citizens often experienced profound psychological shock when suddenly confronting Western consumer abundance. They had learned that gradual, controlled exposure worked better psychologically than sudden, overwhelming immersion. They decided to take Belenko to an American supermarket, but to prepare him carefully first and thoroughly document his reactions for intelligence analysis. On September 15, 1976, 9 days after his dramatic defection, CIA officers took Viktor Belenko to a Safeway supermarket in a Northern Virginia suburb of Washington. They deliberately chose a Wednesday afternoon, a time when the store would be busy enough to show normal operations, but not so crowded as to be overwhelming for someone experiencing such abundance for the first time. They drove to the supermarket in a standard CIA sedan, an ordinary American car that itself impressed Belenko with its comfort, reliability, and features. During the 15-minute drive, Belenko observed suburban Washington, neighborhood after neighborhood of single-family homes, each with yards and garages, streets lined with parked cars, shopping centers with multiple stores, traffic lights that worked consistently, paved roads in good repair. This was ordinary American suburban life, remarkable to Belenko precisely because it was completely unremarkable to Americans. The supermarket parking lot contained approximately 200 automobiles, private vehicles belonging to ordinary people shopping for groceries on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon. In the Soviet Union, the equivalent scenario would involve people arriving on foot, by bus, or perhaps bicycle, with maybe 2 or 3 official vehicles belonging to party members who had access to state cars. Here were 200 private automobiles, casually parked, representing a level of personal wealth that Soviet propaganda had always insisted was impossible under capitalism. The CIA officers would later file extraordinarily detailed reports on what happened next. Viktor Belenko stood at the entrance of the Safeway supermarket for nearly 3 full minutes, apparently unable or unwilling to enter, apparently struggling to process what he was seeing through the glass doors. The store was approximately 25,000 square feet, standard size for American supermarkets of that era, nothing exceptional or unusual by American standards. To Viktor Belenko, it represented an impossibility made real, a fantasy made concrete. Everything Soviet propaganda had taught him couldn't exist. Finally, he entered. The produce section was immediately inside the main entrance. It displayed fruits and vegetables in quantities that exceeded anything Belenko had imagined possible. Multiple varieties of apples, Red Delicious, Golden Delicious, Granny Smith, Macintosh, oranges from Florida and California, bananas from Central America, grapes, both green and red, pears, peaches, plums, lettuce, tomatoes, cucumbers, carrots, potatoes of different types, onions, peppers, both sweet and hot. Produce Belenko couldn't even identify: avocados, artichokes, exotic fruits. Fresh fruits and vegetables displayed casually in mid-September, with no lines, no rationing, no purchase limits, no ration cards required. Belenko approached the orange displays slowly, almost reverently, as if approaching something sacred. In the Soviet Union, oranges were extraordinarily rare, available perhaps once or twice a year in major cities, and then only if one had proper connections. When oranges appeared in Soviet stores, lines formed immediately, sometimes hundreds of people waiting for hours for the chance to purchase one or two oranges per family. The oranges were often partially rotten, having traveled from southern republics without adequate refrigeration. Here were hundreds of oranges, thousands across the entire produce section, piled in casual abundance, perfectly fresh, available to anyone who walked in off the street with money. He picked up an orange with both hands, examined it carefully, felt its weight, smelled it. Then he turned to his CIA handler and asked through the translator, "How much does this cost?" The handler checked the price sign posted above the display. 79 cents per pound. You could probably buy 3 or 4 oranges for $1. Belenko did mental calculations, trying to convert to rubles using both official exchange rates and black market rates he'd heard about. The price, calculated as a percentage of average income, was far lower than Soviet prices for rare goods during the brief periods when such goods were available. But more significant than the price was the simple fact of availability. These oranges were just here, available, unlimited, any day of the week, year-round, through modern agricultural distribution systems. "Anyone can buy these?" Belenko asked. "As many as they want? No limit? No ration card?" "Yes," the handler confirmed. "There's no limit. You can buy 1 orange or 100 oranges, whatever you want or need." Belenko later testified in extensive CIA debriefings that this moment, standing in front of a display of ordinary oranges in an ordinary American supermarket on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon, was when he truly understood that Soviet propaganda was not merely exaggerated or misleading, but systematically, comprehensively, deliberately inverted from reality. The abundance in this standard suburban supermarket on a routine day exceeded anything available to ordinary Soviet citizens, except perhaps the highest party elite who shopped in special restricted stores that regular citizens could never enter. They walked through additional aisles. The meat section displayed choices that seemed impossible. Beef in multiple cuts: ribeye, sirloin, T-bone, ground beef of different fat percentages, pork chops, pork roast, bacon, ham, chicken in multiple forms, whole chickens, chicken parts, boneless chicken breasts, turkey, lamb, various sausages, fish and seafood, fresh fish, frozen fish, shrimp, crab, multiple cuts of multiple types of meat, fresh and frozen, displayed in quantities that would require Soviet citizens to wait in lines for hours if such meat was available at all. In the Soviet Union, meat appeared in state stores perhaps once or twice weekly if citizens were fortunate. And when it appeared, everyone purchased whatever was available regardless of quality or type because no one knew when meat would be available again. The dairy section had milk in both whole and reduced fat versions, multiple types of cheese from various countries and regions, yogurt, butter, sour cream cheese, cottage cheese, ice cream, in dozens of flavors. In the Soviet Union, milk was rationed when available. Cheese was rare and typically of poor quality. Ice cream was a distant childhood memory for most Soviet citizens. The canned goods aisles were particularly overwhelming to Belenko's Soviet sensibilities. Literally hundreds of different products from dozens of different competing companies. Canned vegetables of every type, canned fruits, soups in dozens of varieties, canned meats and fish, sauces, condiments, prepared meals. The variety alone exceeded the total number of products in most Soviet stores, where perhaps 50 to 100 products total might be available, mostly in limited quantities. One entire aisle contained only breakfast cereals. The CIA officer with Belenko counted them: 53 different breakfast cereal products from multiple competing companies in different sizes, flavors, and nutritional formulations. Belenko stood in this aisle for several minutes without speaking. The concept itself was alien and almost incomprehensible. In the Soviet Union, breakfast was typically bread with butter if available, perhaps kasha, buckwheat porridge, maybe tea if one had connections to obtain it. The idea that an entire industry existed simply to provide variety and choice in breakfast options, that consumers could choose from 53 different products for one meal component, represented a level of economic abundance and consumer focus that contradicted everything Soviet ideology taught about capitalism. The frozen food section introduced commercial technology. Belenko hadn't known existed at consumer scale. Multiple aisles of frozen meals, frozen vegetables, frozen fruits, frozen desserts, ice cream, frozen pizzas, frozen dinners that required only heating. Americans, he realized, could purchase complete meals with meat and vegetables and variety, requiring only a microwave oven or conventional oven to prepare, available in dozens of options. His CIA handler noticed Belenko's hands shaking slightly. "Are you okay? Do you need to sit down for a moment?" Belenko shook his head. "This is normal store?" he asked through the translator. "For normal people? This is not special store for government officials?" "Yes, this is just a regular supermarket, nothing special at all. There are probably 50 or 60 stores exactly like this just in the Washington, D.C. area. Hundreds throughout Virginia and Maryland. Thousands across the entire country. This is where normal Americans buy their groceries every week." Belenko walked down another aisle containing cookies, crackers, chips, snacks, and confections. His mind was trying to calculate implications and meaning. If this was a normal store and there were thousands like it across America, and Americans shopped here routinely without special permissions or party connections or ration cards, then everything he had been told for his entire life was not just wrong, but completely, systematically inverted. The checkout area provided another series of revelations. Electronic cash registers that automatically scanned prices and calculated totals, a computerized system that automated transaction processing, professional baggers who packed purchases into paper or plastic bags. The whole operation was efficient, fast, casual, unremarkable. A woman ahead of them in line, middle-aged, ordinary appearance, clearly a regular customer, had a shopping cart filled with groceries. Belenko estimated the quantity would feed his family in the Soviet Union for a month or possibly more. She paid with a personal check while chatting casually with the cashier about the weather and weekend plans. The whole transaction took perhaps 3 minutes. No ration cards, no identity documentation, no party membership verification, no hours-long lines, no connections required. She simply selected what she wanted, paid for it, and left. The register displayed her total, $94.37. Belenko's handler explained that this represented perhaps 10 to 12% of what an average American worker earned in 1 week. In the Soviet Union, equivalent food, if somehow all available simultaneously, which never happened, would cost perhaps 200 and 250 rubles, representing nearly 2 months' salary for an average worker earning 150 rubles monthly. They left the supermarket. Belenko sat in the car for several minutes without speaking, staring straight ahead, apparently trying to process what he had witnessed. His handler later reported that Belenko appeared almost traumatized, not happy or excited, but deeply shaken, as if something fundamental in his understanding of reality had broken. Finally, Belenko spoke in halting English, some of the first English words he had attempted without a translator. "Everything lies. Everything we are told is lies, not exaggeration, not propaganda with some truth, complete lies, everything inverted." The defection of Viktor Belenko, and particularly his reaction to American consumer abundance, would become one of the most symbolically important moments of the Cold War. His story demonstrated that the Soviet Union was losing not through military defeat, but through the simple, undeniable reality that its system couldn't provide for its citizens while claiming to be superior to capitalism. In 1980, Belenko published his autobiography, MiG Pilot, The Final Escape of Lieutenant Belenko, written with journalist John Barron. The book provided extensive detail about his life in the Soviet Union, his growing doubts about Soviet propaganda, his defection, and his profound shock at discovering American abundance. It became an international bestseller and was translated into multiple languages. The book served strategic purposes beyond simply telling Belenko's story. The CIA quietly encouraged its publication and distribution, including arranging for copies to be smuggled into the Soviet Union and Eastern Bloc countries through various channels. The book provided Soviet citizens with detailed testimony from one of their own, not Western propaganda, but the words of a Soviet military officer who had believed what they believed and been taught what they were taught. It was far more credible and devastating to Soviet propaganda than anything Western governments could produce. Copies of Belenko's book circulated in samizdat form throughout the Soviet Union during the 1980s, passed hand to hand, copied and recopied, read secretly, and discussed quietly. Its impact on Soviet morale and the credibility of communist propaganda is difficult to quantify precisely, but was certainly significant. Viktor Belenko became an American citizen in 1980. He married an American woman in 1983 and fathered two sons who grew up as typical Americans, attending public schools, participating in sports, going to college, living in a society where abundance was normal and supermarkets were unremarkable. He worked as an aerospace consultant, providing expertise on Soviet systems to various defense contractors and government agencies. He maintained security consciousness throughout his life, rarely granting interviews, keeping a deliberately low profile, aware that despite the Cold War's end, defectors could never be completely safe from long memories and potential revenge. The KGB and its successor agencies never forgave defectors who had embarrassed the Soviet system so publicly. In August 1991, Viktor Belenko watched on television as the Soviet Union collapsed. The failed hardline coup against Gorbachev, Yeltsin standing on a tank defending democratic reforms, the rapid disintegration of Soviet authority, the declarations of independence from multiple republics. Within months, the Soviet Union ceased to exist, replaced by the Russian Federation and 14 other independent nations. Belenko reflected in later interviews that the Soviet system had been hollow, maintained by lies, and once enough citizens understood the truth about its failures compared to Western success, the structure simply collapsed, not through revolution or military defeat, but through exhaustion and loss of legitimacy. Viktor Belenko passed away on September 24, 2023, at the age of 76 in a nursing home in southern Illinois. His sons, Tom and Paul, were at his bedside. He had lived 47 years in freedom, more than twice as long as he had lived under Soviet control. His story remains one of the most powerful personal narratives of the Cold War. Not the story of military confrontation or nuclear standoff, but the story of one man's determination to discover truth, whatever the cost. He flew across the Sea of Japan not primarily to escape persecution, but to answer a simple question: were American supermarkets real, or were they propaganda? The answer to that question helped explain why the Soviet Union ultimately lost the Cold War. It lost not on battlefields, but in living rooms and kitchens and supermarkets. It lost because it couldn't compete economically, couldn't provide for its citizens, and ultimately couldn't maintain legitimacy once enough people understood that the abundance in American supermarkets wasn't propaganda. It was Wednesday afternoon.